what I thought I'd do, rather than dig into the particulars of this bill, is take a step back and look at the biggest possible picture. And that starts with one thing that's an important reminder, which is that despite how our politics is entirely consumed by talk of the president, and has been for a long, long time, Article 1 of the Constitution makes clear that it is the Congress, the House and the Senate, that control the purse strings. And we often lose sight of this. We often credit our presidents with running the entire show and being responsible for not just spending or deficits, but also economic growth for the country as a whole. None of the people in Washington are actually responsible for economic growth. Economic growth is what we all do as citizens, as workers, as entrepreneurs, as people making stuff. But when it comes to what happens in DC and what happens with deficits and the very rare and occasional surplus, that is mostly a function of Congress. And so I want to take a look at that and what has happened, because we aren't heading in a great direction so far. But let's just take a look at the cold, hard data. All right, so let's start with this. This is from my favorite data source, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. They have this not entirely pretty graph system, but you can find just about anything here, and it is the official data. So this right here is the total public debt, the debt that the federal government has racked up and must be paid by our children, grandchildren, and grandchildren's children. And as you can see, it has just steadily grown. When you go farther back, it looks relatively flat, and in fact it was. But it has just accelerated with a couple key points worth talking about. One is right around here, you see the curve starts to flatten in the late 90s. That's the brief surplus that we'll look at a little closer. When Newt Gingrich was running the Congress and Bill Clinton was saying the era of big government is over. Those are the halcyon days of the late 90s, or as I like to call it, the peak of Western civilization as a Gen Xer. Then we've got a couple bomb movements. One is obviously right here, this change point. That is the financial crisis of 2008. That changed a lot of our lives. That was in some ways the first really, really significant break in the world order of our lifetimes. And it radically accelerated debt. And then it just kind of kept going up. So the trend kind of sucked from there. But the next one is 2020 and the COVID / PPP bailouts, multi-trillion-dollar money printing inflationary disaster that came next. But again, if you notice, after the COVID's over and we're in 2023 and then 2024, the trend accelerated yet again. So what is going on there? Well, let's take a look below the surface. That is the debt, right? That is the stock of total debt owed. That's you take all your credit cards and your mortgage and your car loan, add up the balances if you had to pay them off. And that's what Uncle Sam, which is to say all of us, owe. Outsiders and each other. So how does that happen? Well, that happens by running a deficit, which is different than the debt. The deficit, of course, is the balance between tax receipts, money that Uncle Sam takes in, and money spent, how much Uncle Sam sends out. And that graph is also a complete frigging disaster, but it offers even more of a window into what's been going on. I want to break this into two parts. So first, I am going to set our little clock here to 1970. Because it's hard to even see what was happening there because of how much more horrible it gets. So as you can see, this graph goes all the way back to 1901. And during those times, the government generally ran a surplus, except during brief moments of recession, which is these darker bars. Then you hit World War I. Relatively large deficit. The other thing that's true about this moment is the Federal Reserve is created in 1913. And this is the first time the Fed starts to step in to start printing money. We didn't really have the printing money thing before that, except during the Civil War when greenbacks were printed to help finance the war. But in general, we were on what was called the classical gold standard. You could take these privately issued banknotes or, US dollars and turn them in and actually get gold coins, get gold bars, you name it, you could get it. So you have this brief moment here, followed by a very quick bounce back in 1920 to surplus. And despite what every econ teacher will teach your kids, save for a handful of schools like Chicago, George Mason, and a section of NYU, John Maynard Keynes and Mr. Stimulus is wrong. And this was our first big example of that. There was a very rapid bounce back in the 1920s, and we were running surpluses even as Warren G. Harding cut taxes and cut spending. But he cut spending more than he cut taxes. So we run along, doing pretty well. Okay, hit 1929, even right after 1929, not crazy. Get a little Hoover stuff. FDR starts trying to spend, but again, in relative terms, this is not crazy. This is not like today. And then we have, of course, the massive debts to save the world. This is World War II. So there we are, World War II, first really big instance of deficit bombs. We come out, and we still occasionally have surpluses. Here we go, 1951, $6 billion surplus. 1956, a surplus. 1957, a surplus. The trend is not looking great, but it is still occasional surpluses. And then you start to have the Vietnam War, the Lyndon Baines Johnson, guns and butter. Things get a little rough, 1968. Somehow managed to come back to 1969 in surplus. This is the beginning of one of the major transformations that sets the stage for where we are now. So you've got guns and butter, the Vietnam War, and the passage of the Great Society.
For a century, we labored to settle and to subdue a continent. For half a century, we called upon unbounded invention and untiring energy to create an order of plenty for all of our people. The challenge of the next half century is whether we have the wisdom to use that wealth to enrich and elevate our national life.
I will leave it to you to decide for yourselves whether we had the wisdom there. Not entirely clear to me.
And to advance the quality of our American civilization. For in your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society.
And one more clip from good old LBJ, who is a crazy character in our history, and there's a multi-volume book worth checking out about him, because you want to talk about stealing elections, man, this guy invented it just about. But
the great society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
And this was the change point in our modern era. What came out of the Great Society were several things, huge things. President Trump saying that this fiscal bill passed by the current Congress is the biggest bill in history. I'm sorry, Mr. President. I wish you the best. I like you. You're just wrong. Any one of the bills that was passed by LBJ during the Great Society is far more consequential to the path of the United States than this current bill. The creation of Medicare and Medicaid, the Civil Rights Act, the creation of the modern welfare state as we know it happens here. It happens with LBJ. But even then, we were of a different time. We were a different people. And so LBJ was very adamant that this was not meant to be a dole, to be a permanent source of income for people. In fact, he wrote, "This is not in any sense a cynical proposal to exploit the poor with a promise of a handout or a dole. We know, we learned long ago, that answer is no answer." This is the before times mindset. This is the Protestant work ethic. This is the proud people of Appalachia. This is the intact Black family in America, all of whom, unfortunately, got damaged as much, and perhaps in some cases more, than they got helped, in my opinion. And I think as a matter of the data, by the Great Society. But the Great Society sets the wheels in motion that we are starting to see come off the bus. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's come back to this federal surplus and deficit and expand our graph here a little bit. Now, we were right here, and you can see the reason why I did this is because all of the prior debts ever accrued look like a flat line in comparison to the past 50 plus years, including World War II. This little bump is World War II. And this is where we are now. It's completely crazy. So why does this matter? Why should I care about this? We can still borrow, right? That's actually the fundamental reason why nothing will change in the short run. That's the real story. That's the story that nobody talks about, or very, very few. It is a concept that we have called exorbitant privilege, which is to say a privilege with a very high cost. And that exorbitant privilege is that we issue the world's most popular currency, the US dollar. And we issue the world's favorite safe asset, the US Treasury. And so long as people both in the US and around the world trust that they will get their money back, our politicians will continue to borrow and borrow and borrow until they can't borrow no more. And there's some early signs that the end is near. This last graph, my dear friends, is a chart of 30-year Treasury yields. How much interest Uncle Sam has to promise people in order for them to buy one of his 30-year bonds. And as you can see, over the past 45 years, until recently, yields on bonds have been going down. You know, if you look back to those low interest rate times of the housing boom, the 5-year yield was 4.5%. I'm sorry, the 30-year yield was 4.5%. When there is a recession, yields tend to go down because people run in and buy treasuries because they're afraid. So demand goes up, yield goes down. Oh, I don't care if the yield is low, I want to protect my money, and so interest rates go down during times of recession, or when the Fed is printing money and trying to push yields down. But since the trough of the lockdowns of 2020, yields have been going up and staying up. They aren't at all-time highs like in the aftermath of the Great Inflation, which was what was driving yields through the roof in the 1980s. But they seem to have changed in a way that might persist and might get worse. And if it gets worse, we are in for a lot of pain. We are in for a lot of pain regardless, because something that can't go on forever won't. And the way the Congress, the way our dear leaders act is as if the way to address this is to just see how far we can go. That's the problem we face. All of these graphs really are a kind of, frankly, moral decline. And I came across this framework that frankly is a little chilling. So I almost hate to end here, but I can't help it because it is, well, it might be the cold water we need to jump in so we can get shocked out of where it takes us. And that is this historian, this English historian named Sir John Bagehot Glubb. And he wrote a brief monograph about the 7 stages of empire. So what are we talking about here? Well, at first we've got the age of the pioneers. These are basically People discover the new world. This is the age of Lewis and Clark. This is the age of the new frontier, of the gold rush in California, the Louisiana Purchase, the creation of the country. Awesome. Then we have the age of conquest, in which we build the nation, build the empire, whether it's in America or Rome or ancient Mesopotamia. The last couple are worth thinking real hard about. What are they? So let's start with the age of intellect. The age of intellect sounds pretty familiar. This is when endowments get poured into universities. Debate and criticism flourish, but action slows. Okay. What comes next starts to feel a little uncomfortable for all of us. The age of decadence. What marks the age of decadence? Frivolity rises, birth rates sag, money and politics rule, religion weakens, walls, literal or legal, replace nerve. Okay, sounding familiar? Well, hold on to your seats, because the final step here after the age of decadence is the age of decline and collapse. What is this marked by? And again, he is looking backwards to the great empires of the past several thousand years. Debt, factionalism, and overstretch that sap the strength of the empire. A rival, plague, or a civil war finishes the job. This is the threat that I think is being posed by not having an adults in Washington, and not as a body politic being enough of an adult ourselves. This is the thing that I think we need to come to terms with as individuals. As I sit here, I am 47 years old. And I can say that if it is necessary when I am old to forego government benefits for the sake of my son or my grandchildren, I would do that. I would make that sacrifice. I would say, hey, bud, can I move in with you? We have replaced intergenerational support, multi-generational living and support with the government. And that has been a mistake. That is a mistake that our age of affluence has afforded us, but our age of decadence has squandered. And the only path out of that, and there are some green shoots, like in my opinion, the return of religion, especially among young Gen Z men like my son. The only way out for real is if we grow up and if we take some responsibility for ourselves. And that means looking out into the future and saying, let's not let the age of decadence give way to the age of collapse and decay. We don't have to let that happen. We can avert the disaster, but it is going to take a lot more courage and a lot more willingness to hear reality and look it in the face than our politicians. But that reflects the way they get talked to when they come home. And so it is on us as individuals, as voters, as members of the civil society to say, we're not going to keep kicking the can and letting our kids pick up the tab. That's something that we can start to model now. And I hope we do. Because if we don't, things are going to get pretty tough. And I'm sorry, that's all I got for you today. I hope this is helpful. I hope this gives some context, pulls you back from the sort of news cycle nonsense that treats this bill like it's the most important thing ever. We are in the midst of a long trend, and that trend has to reverse. It isn't happening today. Let's hope it happens tomorrow. If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.